In a little while, I'll introduce you to some of our special guests and dignitaries, but you guys came here for the gospel-motivated education, and so it is my privilege to introduce to you Pastor Evan McClanahan, who is a good friend of the ministry, at one time actually served on our board of directors. Pastor McClanahan, though, is a Southerner. I hope you'll forgive him for that. He forgives you for being Yankees. He's originally from Shreveport, Louisiana, baptized in 1981 at St. Luke's, can I say this out loud? St. Luke's Methodist Church. Now, I hope that you'll rejoice with me, because what that means is, A, our gracious Lord is active even outside of Lutheran congregations, but more importantly, B, we won. In the long run, we captured Evan for the good guys. As a son of Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Shreveport, he was steeped in Lutheran liturgy and theology. He attended Centenary College of Louisiana, earned a BA in music. He then attended Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago for 3 years, had a one-year internship in the LCMS, we call that a vicarage, at St. John Lutheran in Royal, Illinois, and then he met his wife Amanda in Chicago, and they've been married since 2006. He graduated from seminary and was called to Living Word Lutheran Church in Grapevine. I didn't know that, Evan. You know that we had a conference, a regional conference there a few years back at Living Word Lutheran in Grapevine, Texas. Yes. Congregation of LCMC, where he served as associate pastor. In December of 2009, he was called to serve as pastor at First Lutheran in Houston, First Evangelical Lutheran Church in Houston, where he and Amanda are still carrying out their vocation. They have 2 kids, and while at First, Evan has initiated several ministries, including outreach to, this says HCC students. Is that Houston Community College students? The First Word debate and lecture series, and hosting a podcast still exists, still goes live, called Theology on Air. As I mentioned, he has served on the board of Lutherans for Life in the past and currently serves on the board for a local pro-life ministry in Houston called Lifeline. So thank you, Pastor, for that service. His presentation today is congruent with a resource that he recently authored for Lutherans for Life called Biblical Manhood, What Difference Does It Make? And judging by the title, you can already gauge the relevance, because while it has been said that behind every good man is a good woman, it can probably also be said that behind every abortion-minded woman is a failure of a man. So biblical manhood is important to the sanctity of life for a lot of reasons that Pastor's going to discuss with us. That is going to offer a compelling alternative to the ways that the world describes manhood, dangerous ways. And faced with the reality of a cultural revolution, the need for biblical men has never been greater, but also has never been more rewarding. So please join me in welcoming our special guest, Pastor Evan McClanahan.
Well, good morning. That was the longest introduction anyone's ever given me. I don't know if I've ever been introduced, in fact. So that was pretty fancy. But thank you all for coming out on this Saturday morning and afternoon to talk about important issues, to be Lutherans who care enough to do such things. Yeah, my name is Evan McClanahan. Good German Lutheran name, obviously. Obviously, we go way back, you know, into the annals of German Lutheranism. No, we grew up Methodist, like a lot of Southerners. But anyway, and I am the pastor at First Lutheran in Houston. And a lot of people, I've told a few people that, and they said, "Oh, do you know so-and-so?" And I said, "Well, I don't know if you know this, but I'm not LCMS." So we're in the NALC. So hopefully I haven't terribly offended you or hurt any feelings or anything like that. If it makes it feel better, I'm like more conservative than most people in the NALC. So you're safe with me, I promise. But very friendly to the LCMS and love you guys and glad to be here and all of that. When I was asked to talk about this, I have to say I was a little bit bashful about it, a little shy, because I don't really consider myself, like a manly man. I don't go to the gym. I can't bench press my own weight. I mean, I probably could if I really worked at it, but at present, I cannot bench press my own weight. And I do not have a degree in gender studies. And so, I mean, what do I know about gender, But I guess I also kind of feel like the answers to these things should be kind of self-evident. I mean, doesn't everyone know kind of what a man is and what a man's supposed to do and what a woman is and what the Bible has to say about these things? And then I hear people say the craziest things. And I think to myself, well, maybe I do have something to say about it because I think these things are perfectly obvious to the whole world, and then they turn out maybe not to be. But I guess my motivation for writing what I wrote and speaking here today is I do have a 13-year-old son. And, like a lot of parents or future parents or grandparents, I have a lot of anxieties about the world he's growing up in and what he is surrounded by and what kind of a man that he will be. We all worried we're going to be abject failures as parents, that they're going to, I don't know, become liberal or something. Or, not want to get married and not want to have kids. I've told my kids I need 12 grandkids, so start planning in advance for that. But in many ways, he really is growing up in a different world even from me, much less my grandparents, who were almost in a pre-modern world when they were growing up. In his world, we can't define men and women anymore. Not sure if you've noticed that. I don't really trust public schools. We homeschool now. I don't trust hardly any universities. I'm sure the Concordia system is still in pretty good shape, but those were two givens when I was a kid. Of course, he has internet access, which means he has access to basically the worst things humanity has to offer. We have to monitor that. He has a lot fewer organic experiences, what I would consider, coming of age experiences because of school and friendship connections. When I was a kid, we had a bicycle. We could pretty much a radius of a mile, right? We were just free to go and experience life and did some dumb things. But those were coming of age stories. Well, we shelter our kid a lot more now because we're sort of afraid about the world. So that's very different for him. And then I'm hopeful he will have a strong conservative Christian faith, but that puts him more in a minority than it did when I was a kid, when that was still, pretty much a normal thing. So there's a lot to consider as I think about these young men and what they're influenced by. What I wanted to do was try not to hold back, not to be politically correct or milquetoast, because I do think the time for soft pedaling is over. We need to be quite clear, quite bold, like Jonah, in what we have to say. And we have to be unapologetic about something as basic as what men and women are and what they're supposed to be up to. And if we can't be or won't be, then we're not going to have a civilization left to protect for much longer. I want to begin with some bad versions of masculinity, because those are going to be a lot more prolific than the good examples that we might be able to offer in our limited time with our young men or older men in the church. So I want to ask, who has ever heard of the Tate brothers? Raise your hand if you've heard of the Tate brothers. A few of you, yeah. They've made news because they have been arrested in Romania. They had some unsavory businesses. There are a lot of supporters, though. Of course, they have a lot of followers. They're more or less social media following. He's a kickboxer. His father was like a world chess champion. But he has and he had businesses, I would say, again, that were quite unsavory. But he has a following because he encourages young men to be fit, get Bugattis. Those are Italian sports cars. Be attractive to women. Be bold in your masculinity. He has a huge following, millions and millions of followers. So if you don't know who he is, unfortunately, you probably need to. Because your son probably does, your grandson probably does. And you need to counter what they have to say. He just converted, as I understand, to Islam, in fact, even though he's British, because Islam presents a masculine version of masculinity, I guess. Who has ever heard of the book, this is more obscure, Bronze Age Mindset? Yeah, Bronze Age Mindset. Long story, won't go into it, written by kind of an interesting guy, very, very smart guy, but the book and his Twitter handle, which also has a pretty significant following, describes this kind of ideal of going back, well, to the Bronze Age, you know, when men were men and women were women. It's definitely patronizing, definitely uncomfortably, I would say, misogynistic, you know, in kind of the bad sense of things. But these are people out there that are on Instagram and Twitter feeds that, again, your sons and grandsons are looking at. Who's ever heard of the Fresh and Fit YouTube channel? Fresh and Fit. Again, health nuts, you know, workout. Did you know that working out is like a conservative thing? Did y'all know that? In fact, working out and raising your testosterone apparently makes you more conservative. So there's this kind of overlap between our worlds and these like kind of hyper-masculine worlds of fitness, of eating right, of going to the gym, of getting in shape, and all of that. Anyway, Fresh and Fit, not Christian. They will encourage young men, for example, do we have children in the room? Let's see. Anyway, to be with lots of women, right? To be with lots of women, to get good at being with women, to find one for marriage. Okay, so this is all out there. This is on YouTube. They have millions of followers. How about the Paul brothers? Jake Paul, I think, is fighting Mike Tyson. They were supposed to fight last month. I think it's been moved to December. So if you've not heard of the Paul brothers, you should know who the Paul brothers are. Mike Tyson. Who's heard of Mike Tyson? Okay, okay. What about Jordan Peterson? Okay, more have heard of Jordan Peterson. Now that's he's not a Christian, I wouldn't say, but he's kind of more in our wheelhouse. Kind of got the intellectual arguments for being a responsible human being, which, you know, and he does have a huge male following. I mean, it's been commented on, I think 90%. I'm making that number up, but a lot of his following is male, and his advice is pretty simple. You know, he says we evolved from lobsters, and we need to sit up straight and clean our room. It's something like that. I mean, who knew you could make millions of dollars telling people to clean their room? I mean, mothers, you should be getting a bonus check in the mail like any minute, right? Anyway, these are the world's responses, though, to a culture that minimizes men, that makes men toxic, that says that men are the problem, men are oppressors. And so the answer is this kind of, you know, not in every way bad, but a worldly response that basically says, hey, we're not bad, we've got great biceps, and there's nothing wrong with being a man, and, you know, we are leaders, and we need to lead, and this sort of thing. But in the end, they're not Christian, and I would say they openly endorse promiscuity, vulgarity, and very worldly behavior. So that's kind of the worldly response to the claim of toxic masculinity. Then in the church, there have been some really what I would consider maybe well-intentioned but kind of ham-fisted approaches to, you know, engaging with men. Maybe on Father's Day, for example, the pastor tries to drive a motorcycle into the church. You ever see those YouTube videos? Yeah, they don't end well, usually. They crash, you know, they little too much gas on the accelerator, you know. So that's embarrassing. Less embarrassing, but still in the same view. This was an example I put in the essay, which was on Father's Day 2022. Graceway Baptist Church in Missouri hosted a car show. I mean, you know what? I have a 1977 MGB. I like cars. I think old cars are cool. But like to try to like appeal to men because they like cars seems a little, I don't know. I mean, when are we going to get around to the gospel? You know what I'm saying? That's like the least offensive way to appeal to men, but still, it goes to show that we feel the need to appeal to men because churches on average are something like 55 to 60% women. And then I don't know if this appeals to men or women, but I just thought I would mention it. There's this huge church, I think it was in Atlanta, where the pastor came in like on a thing, he's like floating in the air, like all the way to the front. Is that a thing that appeals to men? I don't know. I thought it was kind of silly, but churches will do anything, and I think the point is that we need to be secure in how we understand our theology, how we understand maleness, femaleness. We don't need gimmicks. You know, and so I would just say those are all some sort of bad examples. So I want to get to some good understandings of masculinity, but first we have a really important question to answer. I think everyone in this room will agree with me 100%, but just in case, a question, if we do not ask and answer, it's going to make our progress simply impossible. And so the question is this: can Christians say that while men and women are truly of equal value, they are fundamentally different? Can we say that? Okay, I've already heard a yes, not seeing any argument. Well, just in case, I'm going to make the case that that is true. Can we say that men, as men, have peculiar roles and duties that women cannot, or at least should not, fulfill? Can we say that men are made so different from women, generally, if not universally, and not just physically, but temperamentally and emotionally? Well, of course, there's a lot of overlap, but we're speaking in generalities here. That it could actually be an offense to God himself to confuse the roles of men and women. Yeah, I think the answer to that has to be yes. We kind of have to start there. So people often end up arguing about the end of the line sorts of things. But if you just ask the question, well, are men and women different? In what ways are they different? You're going to get to some pretty clear conclusions. In ancient times, and even in much of the non-Western world, since we've sort of lost our sanity, this was so obvious that men and women were different. No one needed to explain this. You know, they didn't need the brilliant Matt Walsh film, What is a Woman? Right, to explain to people that men and women are different, you know, in ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt or something. Anybody see that movie, by the way? What is a Woman? Yeah? Oh, you should all watch it. I think you can watch it somewhere for free. Of course, he has a new movie that came out, I think, yesterday. We've already bought our tickets. We're trying to support those things in the culture. Am I a racist? Anyway, we'll talk about racism at next year's event. But there is a scene in that movie where Matt Walsh humorously goes to Africa, and he talks to a famous tribe in Kenya there, and he kind of tries to explain transgenderism, etc., to this tribe in Kenya, and they more or less look at him like, I'm sorry, I'm not understanding what you're saying here. You're saying men think that they can be women, and women think that what is happening in your part of the world. Now, technology, I would argue, has been in the West kind of an equalizer to some degree, right? Men and women can often end up, say, working at computers, so to some degree we end up kind of doing some of the same work. But I would argue that as the civilized West gets more dangerous, which it is, the need for strong men is actually increasing and not decreasing. Women, meanwhile, will bear children. I don't know if y'all know that, but women bear children. They are best served, among other vocations, I would argue, to nourish young children. Of course, fathers are needed in that as well. There are physical realities, though, that simply cannot and will never change. More to the point, as Christians, if we deny those realities, I think we are on the verge or maybe have crossed the line into blasphemy. Because we are now saying that God's creation is not what it actually is. And so that is a line we definitely do not want to cross. So that's the question that must be answered first. I think you're all in agreement. That's a good thing. I'll give an example of how that was not offered once very quickly. I work with a ministry called Theology by the Pint. It's like a young adults gathering, maybe 100, 200 people. We have craft beer there. Hope that's okay. We, various discussions once a month. Anyway, we did one on like women in ministry, 2 women, 1 conservative, 1 more liberal, you might say, kind of gave their answers to that. And there was a panel discussion. I mean, they looked at the Greek version of, meanings of words, and they looked at Bible verses about how women are silenced and contextualized them. And they looked at all these things. But at no point did anyone simply just say, hey, men and women are different. And maybe that's just a good starting point, that we can just say that and make other people prove otherwise. It would have that conversation could have gone in a much more positive way if that had simply been said. And yet, as obvious as it is to us, there are men and women sports. There are women on the front lines of militaries. women are outsourcing motherhood to outside groups, professionals, you might say. Men are using women as surrogates to have their children for them. Purportedly, Christian churches, now purportedly is doing a lot of work in this sentence, but they're hosting drag events. You might have seen the Sparkle Creed that was recited a few years ago at some church in Iowa. That was humorous. Oh, Minnesota? You're like, not in Iowa. Yeah. But anyway, men and women are different, and not only is that okay, that's good. That's how God made us. Now, what is biblical manhood? Our definition has to be biblical on that. It's right there in the title. We're not going to be looking to sociology, psychology, etc. And again, I hope that's obvious to all of us, but it's pretty normal practice for even Christians to borrow from other disciplines to answer these sorts of questions. It's a bad habit. If you're into it, you might want to break it. What is biblical manhood? And how do we answer that question? I mean, you know, there's lots of men in the Bible. Do we sort of take a survey of all the men and look at all their characteristics and average it out to an ideal man? A 7.5 version of a man in the Bible does this, this, and this. Do we look at specific men, you know, like Noah or Abraham or Jacob or Moses or the apostles or the prophets or Jesus himself? I mean, after all, Jesus is a man. He's the Son of God, you know, born of a woman, born under the law. He would probably have a lot to say about manhood. And then there is what the Bible kind of says about men, you know, in generalities. You know, Paul says things about husbands, and, you know, there's parts of the Old Testament law that apply only to men. So maybe we could do that. What I really wanted to do was consider the unique way that the Bible speaks about men. So what's unique about being a man in sort of God's world? You know, there are aspects of our Christian life, of course, that men and women absolutely share. For example, we're all to be virtuous. We pursue the same sort of virtues. We pursue the same faith. So there's a lot that is the same with men and women. But what does the Bible say that pertains especially or maybe even only to men? Well, first, I would say that men are leaders. Men are leaders. Men are priests in the temple. Men are kings. Men are judges. Men are prophets. Men are apostles. Men are elders. Now, yes, women do have some of these roles, like Deborah is often cited, and yet that is, I think, clearly the exception to the rule. I would say then men are leaders in 3 places primarily: in the household, on the battlefield, and in the area of spiritual warfare, and others as well. But, and I don't see this, by the way, as any kind of demotion of women, even though the modern world will say that. To the contrary, men really require, they need to hold this burden of leadership. You know, leadership's not really a lot of fun. A lot of people don't like you. You get a lot of criticisms. It's a burden, and yet that is the burden that men are called to carry. They must provide for their family, fight wars, lead congregations, and literally do the heavy lifting and the dirty jobs that still modern civilization requires. I meant to look this up. There are stats, if you look on the kind of dirty and hard jobs that men do, and, you know, like 96% of construction workers are men, and, you know, in the lumber industry and all these heavy, you know, manufacturing and so forth, it's way in the 90% of men that do these sorts of jobs, firefighters and military and on and on. And so these are tough jobs that men have to do. Now, the feminist argument is something like, but the men, they get into these leadership positions and they domineer over their wives and children. They become brutes, and you know what we would say is, yeah, sometimes that happens, and it's wrong because they're not leading as biblical men either. So just leading in and of itself isn't enough. There are ways that you have to lead. Indeed, Jesus says in Matthew 20, "But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So, whenever the argument is made, well, men lead and they do a terrible job of it. Well, some men do. What we're calling on is for all men to lead as biblical men. So number one, men bear the responsibility of leadership, household, battlefield, spiritual warfare. Paul writes, "For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior." Now again, that doesn't mean that men get to abuse their wives or control them, but it does mean that men are the leaders of the family. As such, he is expected to provide for his wife and children, to sacrifice for them, to labor without complaint, and to protect them when necessary. The concept of women fighting on the battlefield, I should go without saying, is completely foreign to the Bible, and it should be foreign in our own day. Just because warfare is not this constant threat, we have the draft and so on and so forth, still, by virtue of being the stronger sex, men must fight war's battles when the choice is to fight or die. And I just don't see any justification for women, maybe in the military and many, in some capacity, but not on the battlefront at all. And then spiritual warfare. When the church is doing its job, it should be coming under attack from the evil one. The devil has every intention to destroy the work of gospel proclamation and community building and forgiveness in the name of Jesus. So therefore, Christians and pastors should and will find themselves under spiritual attack because they are posing a threat to the devil's domain. Just as no biblical man really should give the battlefield over to his wife or daughter, I don't think you can justify, therefore, a biblical man conceiving of a woman bearing the full assaults on the sheep of Christ. Now, I'm not saying that women also won't come under spiritual attack or have their own temptations. I'm only saying that in positions of leadership, those attacks may come more strongly and more often. Now, I will say I don't have great answers for some of the other realms of life, like, say, business or politics or civic life generally. I think the Bible is less clear about that. The world has changed. The world has evolved. Politics is sort of a dirty business, and I can't imagine anyone wanting to get involved. But here we have a candidate for president who is a woman, and not the first by any means. And I guess I would say it does seem to me that women are more free to pursue careers in those vocations, biblically speaking. I think there could be arguments either way. I just don't have strong feelings about it, I guess. Although if you look at the voting patterns of men and women, that they are becoming quite diverse. Young men, I think, tend to be more and more conservative these days, which is a pretty good sign, I think, for us. But young women are more and more not conservative. So there's this kind of interesting thing going on where I think my son will have a harder time finding a conservative wife than my daughter will have finding a conservative husband, So that is interesting, but by the way, just because you are a man doesn't mean that you're good at leading. So, this is one of when we talk about something like women's ordination, and we do have female pastors in my denomination, just because you're a man doesn't mean that you're a good pastor. And there have been a lot of women who are very faithful and strong, and I have questions about women's ordination, but I appreciate that there have been very conservative and strong, women. And anyway, so just because you are a man doesn't mean you're good at leading. You still need to learn how to lead and ask for guidance and that sort of thing. Okay, 2. So men are leaders. Number 2, men are workers. Women, of course, work very hard. No woman has worked as hard as raising children. Would never want to take that away from a woman. But biblical men cannot, and they must not be a non-worker. Right? Paul really chastises those in Thessalonica for being lazy. They're hoping the end of the world will come so they don't have to show up and go to work that morning. He writes, "We urge you, brothers, do this more and more, and to aspire to live quietly and to mind your own affairs, to work with your hands as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all." In Proverbs, this is one of it's one of the more comedic lines, I think maybe in the whole Bible. But the lazy man is mocked over and over throughout Proverbs. And in Proverbs 22 it reads, "The sluggard says, 'There is a lion outside. I shall be killed in the streets.'" Which just shows the depth that someone will go to get out of a day's work, you know. "I can't go to work today. There's a lion out there," you know. I don't think there was actually a lion, but, you know, you'll say anything. So Christians, men are to work and be the providers to the best of their ability. 3, a biblical man does not, though, have to be a physical specimen as a man. You know, on the way here, we drove past the ESPN headquarters. And when I was a kid, you know, male athletes were all the rage. I think the ESPN talks more about the WNBA than the NBA now. But anyway, obviously the sports has become another leftist enterprise. So masculinity and the celebration of great athletes as men, that's, you know, greatly diminished in our own day. But if you look at someone like Zacchaeus, what do we say about him? He was a what? A wee little man. He was a wee little man. And yet, of course, he was a tax collector, and he ripped off his customers, which is why he promises upon his conversion, you might say, to pay back fourfold what he had taken from other people. But Zacchaeus, this wee little man, he is a biblical man. Not because he's big or fast or athletic, but because he has the humility and the strength to acknowledge that he has sinned before God, and he is willing to set things right. Pride is surely a great sin, one men may be more suspect to than women, but it leads to terrible harm. It demands a correction. And Zacchaeus is more of a man than many of our modern athletes, to be sure, could ever hope to be because of his remarkable accountability. 4, biblical men build others up because they are in the habit, as Paul says, they are in humility to count others more significant than yourselves. That's just kind of the daily operation of being a Christian. Just because men as the stronger sex may bear more responsibility than women, they are never to use that power in a sinful way. Consider Paul's admonition to fathers, for example. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So we don't have the luxury as biblical men of being boorish, of being overbearing. We build others up. Biblical men pay attention to their children. They do not mercilessly or abusively discipline them. Rather, they patiently instruct them and teach them and love them. They draw out the best of them. And as my son plays baseball, I'm sort of done coaching him now. I've handed him off to better coaches than me. But the temptation is there, in the normal discipline or on the sports field to yell and to scream and to, and that's not what we're called to be as biblical men. And then finally, men are to build up their wives. We have already spoken of how men are to protect and provide for their wives, but in the example of Jesus and Paul, I know neither of them had a wife, but you see them lifting up women to rather unusual heights. While not elevated to the rank of apostle, women are entrusted with the proclamation of the gospel and many acts of service in the church. Only a woman, for example, in the gospel receives this accolade by Jesus. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. A few more examples. Priscilla, remember Priscilla and Aquila. I'm from Texas now, so I say Akia? Is that Akia? No. Priscilla and Aquila, whenever they're both named, her name is first. Which was very unusual for a woman. Probably means she had some kind of high standing in the community. 2, Paul welcomes the ministry of many women, right, as he is planting churches. We see many of them listed in Romans 16, for example. 3, Jesus receives many women as disciples. I think that's undisputed. 4, even in the Old Testament, women had many more rights than their pagan counterparts, who were much more treated merely like property. And so this actually had the effect of diminishing patriarchalism, because women, while the weaker sex in the Old Testament, are not the lesser sex. And then, of course, the creation itself paints Eve as a partner, a helpmeet to Adam. Finally, to end, I want to share a portion of a recent sermon I gave on James' teaching on the imperative to care for widows and orphans. Ends up kind of being a lot about men somehow. This is what James calls pure and undefiled religion. And as I said, hey, if there's a pure and undefiled version of anything, I want to know about it. If there's a pure and undefiled version of baseball, let me know what it is, so that we can resolve these disputes about sabermetrics versus small ball and stuff like that. Anyway, but here James says, of course, pure and undefiled religion is caring for widows and orphans and being unstained from the world. But in this world, in James' world, women and children were especially vulnerable because men could easily disappear. They might die in war. They might die or be injured on the job. They didn't always have the luxury of sitting behind screens. They were dealing with rocks and boulders and iron and hot things and diseases. They didn't even have antibiotics or workers' comp, right? So men were pretty vulnerable, which meant women and children were vulnerable. And then there were just the garden variety sins that would give rise to unwanted children or divorce or separation. So it's no wonder that women would often find themselves alone and children would find themselves orphans. Survival in the ancient world was not some kind of like human right. All right, it was just what happened on a day that you didn't happen to die. There were no welfare programs. There was no Social Security. There was no Medicare or Medicaid. And so these Christians, these men and women Christians, our forebears many centuries ago, they were changed by the love of Christ, and they were given this example to follow, and they simply gravitated to help those in need, these vulnerable women and children. While everyone else would often quite literally leave these vulnerable out to die, the Christians could not and they would not. So pure and undefiled religion then. It wasn't offering sacrifices anymore. It was caring for those most deeply in need. Now, today, you may have noticed that widows and orphans have a lot of competition. A lot of other victims out there that we really need to be paying attention to. Minorities of all kinds are, by definition, victims. They're on the victim matrix or hierarchy, you might say. The poor, they are victims. LGBTQ, they also are victims. Now, I live in a big city, so I can tell you that the homeless, they are victims. Drug addicts are considered victims. In fact, criminals themselves are considered victims. Pretty much the only people these days who are not victims are those who work hard, obey the law, pay confiscatory taxes, and, pretty much keep the society going. Nobody feels bad for them. In fact, they're often considered to be the problem. They are the oppressors of this whole deal. But not everyone who is down on their luck reaches widow or orphan status. In fact, there remains, as far as I can tell, virtually no excuse for a man not to provide and care for his wife and children, shy of some serious disability, of course. Which means then that churches should basically offer no ministry for men, if I might be so bold, shy of course, evangelizing them and discipling them, and maybe thanking them from time to time for shouldering their share of this burden of civilization. Now, if I'm right, how might ministry look different? And again, I'm kind of writing this from the perspective of being in a big city where I see a lot of men, go to the homeless shelters or all the various places and be served. And as I've gotten older, it sort of disgusts me, if I'm being honest, more and more. Ministry might look different by offering food and shelter donations only for women, and children, of course, and turning the men away at the door. The church would become the sole provider of social relief. Impossible to imagine, I know, but ending the government's near monopoly on charity and returning all of that tax money. Of course, ministry in the church would be unabashedly pro-life if we care about orphans, because there is no greater orphan than the unprotected unborn. We would create or support job training for widows, perhaps, or maybe women also abandoned by their husbands. In a perfect world, we would completely repeal the sexual revolution, which leads, of course, to orphans, and if not widows, a whole lot of single mothers. And then this was something Pastor Salamink and I were talking about on the way from the airport. I think it's worth an idea to consider, if we can't reform the foster system, to go back to orphanages. If they could be public places where communities were around these places and we really cared for orphans in that way. I kind of blame Annie, you know, the movie, for kind of ruining orphanages for all of us. Or not that anyone would want to necessarily be in an orphanage, but my concern of the foster system is that while there are many wonderful people in the foster system, there are sort of some horrors going on that remain hidden, and that's a concern. But obviously, so many of our social problems would and could be solved if men were biblical men. If men were able and willing to lead as they have been made to do so and encouraged to do so, rather than told that we are in some way, you know, the victimizers or the oppressed of society. So I guess to conclude, biblical men and women are actually alike in many respects. They have the same callings to be virtuous, to be obedient, to be faithful, to be gracious. But men and women are different, despite the radical and absurd claims by those in our day who possess an unbiblical worldview. And their differences mean that their roles will be different. And that's okay. To the extent that men are uniquely called to lead, that is a burden for them, not a privilege to be abused. Rather than warring against the patriarchy, I hear Taylor Swift is up to that these days, we would be wise to support men and who seek to lead in a biblical manner. The world tells them so often they are the root cause of so many problems, leading to a withdrawal from leadership or a truncated view of mankind. Loving and supporting men would be a great way of helping them to be better biblical. Thank you for your time, and I think there is some time for questions, or if anyone would like to do so. Or throw any tomatoes at me. Yes, sir.
So, what are the baby steps for us here to implement some of these great ideas?
Some of the ones I mentioned about, that's a great question. Yeah. Well, do you mean on the talk as a whole? At the end, I was talking about some specific ministries dealing with like widows and orphans and things like that. If you work with a local, or if you have a local food shelter or pantry or something like that, I think at some point we need to tell men that we're not going to enable them, that we have high expectations for them, which would mean turning men, like I said, turning men away at the outset, and that we are going to prioritize women in ministry. Of course, in the more liberal churches, they're more involved in the victim matrix, so the minority, the poor, again, of course we have a heart for the poor, that's a broad term, but LGBT, I mean, there are all these like ministries focused on everything but widows and orphans, and I think maybe we should be looking at the ministries we do, because we are susceptible to mission creep, and we should basically say, is this a widows and orphans ministry? Is this a widows and orphans ministry? Now, we have administrative tasks and preaching and so on and so forth, but we might need to look at the things we do and kind of cull and kind of say, if we're not doing widows and orphans ministry, we maybe ought not to be doing it. In terms of biblical manhood, I I think I mentioned a lot of the influencers at the beginning. I think we need to be like aware of who they are and mention them, because your confirmation students probably won't tell you that Andrew Tate has the most amazing Bugatti of all time, and he's like a really cool guy, and I want to be like him. But they follow them on social media. So if we can like kind of drop things in from time to time, mention some of these influencers and kind of talk about why they're wrong, that I think would be a good thing. Start, you know, posting a counter argument to that. And as I said, thanking men. I think men, there's this weird thing where, you know, in a church that has female clergy, you tend to get less male clergy, right? So over time, there's something about men where we give up. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's actually a weird form of kindness or humility to basically say, oh, you want to do this too now? Okay, I'll just... Or maybe it's passive aggressiveness. Oh, you want to be a pastor? Oh, well, see how easy it is, you know. And so in the more liberal denominations, I mean, I think probably the vast majority of their pastors will be female and so on and so forth. But there's this thing that happens where when we criticize men or we offer women to do what men sort of have traditionally done, men are kind of like, oh, okay, I'll just step back. And maybe we need to be more vocal in saying, thank you, men, for doing things, for doing this, for going totally unnoticed as you work a 50-hour work week and you mow the lawn and you do the oil changes yourself on your own car and you show up to committee meetings. I think, in fact, I'll say that now. Thank you, men, for doing that. Often goes unnoticed. We don't really want anyone to thank us for it. We're sort of uncomfortable, but it's kind of scary to think where we'd be without all those things going on. So, yes, sir.
And in the last several weeks, we've talked about David and Jonathan's relationship.
I'll repeat it. Yeah.
What's that?
I said I'll repeat what you're saying for those in the back. I have a microphone, so.
David and Jonathan's relationship, we had a lot of discussion about that relationship because it was so loving and so sacrificial. And I think from your comment that men we need to love and support men. I think we need to counteract society's lies about the love men can have for one another. Purely.
Yeah.
And I think in the church that's where it starts. I think we as men in America in particular will shy away from that closest, loving, supportive relationship of men because of the lies around us.
Right. Did y'all know that Abraham Lincoln is gay now? Have y'all heard that? Yeah, there's a new movie that's coming, a new documentary coming out. They claim he shared a bed with a man for 4 years. I don't know if y'all know this, but back before every human on earth had their own queen bed, Posturepedic, Tempur-Pedic, something or other, people shared beds. They didn't have a lot of beds to go around. Anyway, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is said to, he and Everhard Bethke, his good friend and biographer, they were said to be gay. And of course, we all know St. Paul was secretly gay. Maybe y'all don't hear these things in the LCMS, but we hear these things all the time. Well, not we anymore, but in the old days. So he was saying in the Bible study of 1 Samuel, there's this thing about David and Jonathan and how the LGBTQ crowd will say, oh, David had love for Jonathan like no woman or no other woman or something to that. And so therefore they must have had a gay relationship. And that's something that has really been lost. We have allowed the gay community to really kill the intimate friendships and bonds that men can have with one another. And I do think that is unfortunate, and I would like to see men be able to be friends again without people saying, oh, are they, And so obviously I have no regard for the LGBTQ community, but so I do think, we need to reclaim that. But yes, ma'am, and then...
I think
Yeah. 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 Yeah, we actually, somewhere on YouTube, the Theology by the Pint group I talked about, we did a thing about homosexuality maybe 6 months ago, and I said to the presenter, I said, I need to talk about sodomy. And she's like, no, you can't say that word. So, well, the Bible says that word. And so I ended up not, out of a kind of a, anyway, it's a distinction used, but the position I held was very clear, and we did talk about the act. Anyway, I don't want to go there, but it's a shame that we can't talk about that kind of perversion has allowed us to. Well, we can. You're right. Yeah, that's the point. We can. We just do it. Yes, sir, and then.
I'm going to double down on what you just said.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, euphemism.
Yeah.
The word gay, and all these words they've stolen from us. You know, like the rainbow used to be Noah's.
Yeah.
You know.
So reclaim.
I think we have to really, as Marla said, use the correct terminology, because then it's more condemning than affirming.
Yeah.
We're affirming their actions.
Right.
We see it.
Even the phrase I use, the LGBTQ community, is an incorrect phrase. It doesn't exist. It's a if you spend. I had a radio show on a very liberal radio station in Houston, trying to get the gospel in this kind of dark place for a while. And let me tell you, they hate each other. Okay, you get into that world and you realize they can't stand each other. They are just nothing but fractions that fight all the time, and they have all these weird intersectional politics where white gay men are very lowly regarded by black lesbians and so forth. It's a strange thing. But I think we're just about out of time. But I saw a hand up here, and then I'll cede the floor. Yeah, men can isolate, and it can be quite dangerous, actually. So we do need men to be in community. Yes, ma'am.
Baby steps. Be comfortable in your faith enough to speak up.
Yeah.
Right? My girlfriend said her nephew is now a woman, and I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry for you, but that's mental illness. How can we help?
Yeah.
And somebody in my youth group said, oh, love Harry Styles, I look up to him. And then somebody else in the youth group said, do you know who Harry Styles is? Do you know what he professes? Do you know what he speaks about? And so being comfortable enough in your faith to speak.
Yeah.
Kindness and love would say no.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another symbol. This is more obscure, but Harry Styles has a big butterfly tattoo on his chest, I think. That's a Christian symbol, right? It should be anyway, and it's not really a Christian symbol anymore. I assure you, it's not because of he doesn't have that tattoo because he's a Christian. So yeah, I agree. We need to speak out. Like as I said, the time for soft pedaling is over. I didn't give all my radical ideas in this speech. I didn't want to, you ought to think I was totally crazy. But anyway, thank you so much for having me. I know my time is up, so thank you.